For 7 years I didn't exist to him. Same gatherings, same glittering halls, and he moved past me as though I were transparent. No look, no hesitation, not a single flicker in his expression to acknowledge I was there. 7 years of holding it in, until the night I decided to stop being invisible and showed up on the wrong man's arm. The room felt it instantly. The silence dropped like a guillotine, and for the first time in 7 years, he looked at me, not like I was real, like I had just lit a fuse inside a room full of gunpowder. He cut across the ballroom, seized my hand without permission, leaned in until his lips nearly grazed my ear and whispered, low enough that only I could hear, "You shouldn't have come with him." What I didn't know, what no one had ever told me, was that all those years of silence were never indifference. They were something else, something far more dangerous. And by the time I understood why, 2 brothers were already at war over a claim to something I never knew was in play. One offering me a way out too perfect to be safe, the other shielding me in a way that felt too much like a cage. The question was never who I loved. The question was what they were keeping from me, and why. Chapter 1. The Blue Dress. I had no business being there. I was aware of that even as I traced the eyeliner for the second pass, my fingers surprisingly calm while the rest of me trembled beneath the surface. The mirror in my Palermo flat showed a woman who appeared prepared for anything. Composed, sharp, deliberate. But behind that reflection, I was fighting a losing battle against every rational thought I'd ever had. "So you're actually doing this?" Giada leaned against the bathroom doorframe, arms folded, wearing that look, the one that said she'd already judged the situation and was simply biding her time before telling me exactly how stupid I was. She was my closest friend, the owner of a small vintage textile shop in the heart of Palermo, and the only human being capable of dissecting my worst choices before I'd even finished making them. "Doing what?" I said, all innocence, smoothing down the blue dress that hugged every curve with unapologetic precision, showing up at the Cavouri ball hanging off Ennio's arm. She crossed the room and reached for the strap sliding down my shoulder, pulling it back into place. "Isata, sweetheart, I adore you, but this isn't bravery. This is warfare dressed in a neckline." I said nothing. She was right, and saying so out loud would have made the whole thing too solid, too irreversible. The annual Cavouri Ball was the single most significant gathering on Sicily's eastern coast. I'd been going since I was small, first trailing behind my father, a man who hovered at the edges of that world, then as the girl nobody quite understood why they kept inviting. But the reason was uncomplicated. Pride. Raw, obstinate pride. The same kind that had held me upright since I was 17, when my father died and left behind a surname worth nothing, and debts worth everything. 7 years on, at 24, I was still on my feet. Same steady hands, same refusal to bend. The only difference was that now I understood dignity wasn't something passed down through blood. It was something you clawed at, day after day, until it fused to your skin like a scar. Giada met my eyes in the mirror, and the sharpness left her face. Why him, Isotta? Why Ennio? I knew exactly why. The answer sat inside me with a painful clarity. 7 years of Ruggiero Cavouri treating me like air, 7 years of his gaze drifting through me as though I were transparent, had driven me to the one place guaranteed to get under his skin, his younger brother's side. It had nothing to do with Ennio. It never did. It was about the invisible girl proving that somebody, somewhere, could actually see her. He asked me. I answered, and the sharp click of the lipstick cap put an end to the conversation. The car Ennio had sent was black, elegant in its restraint, the interior thick with the scent of fresh leather. I climbed in by myself. Giada remained on the sidewalk outside my building, arms still crossed, her parting words lodged in my skull. "If things go bad, you call me. If things go well, call me anyway. I won't sleep until I know." The drive to the family estate beyond the outskirts of Catania gave me more than enough time to catalog every reason this was a terrible idea, and not nearly enough to convince me to turn back. The Cavouri estate rose from the hillside like something alive, ancient stone walls, torches flickering low along the drive, a sea of expensive cars that stripped away any pretense of casualness. This wasn't a party. It was a demonstration. Every detail carried the same unspoken message. We are the Cavouri, and your presence here is a privilege we granted. Ennio stood at the base of the grand staircase, waiting. At 27, Ruggiero's younger brother possessed the sort of looks that functioned like a snare. A disarming smile, gentle eyes, hands that settled on your arm with a tenderness so polished it had to be practiced. He extended his arm and told me I looked stunning, with a sincerity that felt almost too convincing to believe. I took his arm anyway. That was the decision I'd already made. We entered together, and the room responded, not with sound, but with that particular hush that falls when something shifts, and every pair of eyes registers it at once. I could feel the stares before I placed them. Curiosity, judgment, calculation. In Sicily, arriving at a Cavour ball on a Cavour's arm was never just a date, it was a declaration. Donna Silvia sat beside the fireplace, spine straight as a blade, her gaze sharp enough to draw blood. The Cavour matriarch, 70 years old, and draped in an elegance that could wound. She studied me over the edge of her glass, not with hostility, not with surprise, but with something far more unsettling, evaluation. As though she were quietly estimating how many minutes I'd last before grasping that I didn't belong. I met her stare for a beat, then two, before turning away, not because she'd bested me, but because I chose my fights carefully, and hers could wait. Ennio steered me through the ballroom with the effortless grace of someone raised inside these walls. I let him lead while my eyes, traitorous, restless, swept the room in search of the one person I'd promised myself I wouldn't seek out. And there he was. Ruggiero Cavour stood near the bar, a glass resting in his hand with the stillness of a man who never needed to move to command an entire room. At 31, the head of the Cavour family was the kind of presence that silenced people without uttering a single word. Dark suit, no tie, the family signet ring, a crowned lion with a dagger clenched between its fangs, catching the light on his finger. Everything about him spoke in the same quiet, lethal language. I am the threat you've learned to call refinement. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was simply standing there, perfectly still, and staring straight at me. I knew every version of Ruggiero's gaze, the one that slid through me as if I weren't solid. The one that turned away like avoidance was muscle memory, the one that reduced me to furniture. But this look was none of those. This one carried weight. It carried heat. It carried something I couldn't define but felt flood through my entire body, as if someone had set a match to every nerve ending at once. I didn't look away. Not tonight. I held his stare with the full force of everything that 7 years of silence had built inside me, and one thought burned through my mind. See me. For once in your life. See me. At my side, Ennio gave my arm a gentle squeeze. When I glanced at him, a smile played on his lips. The kind that never quite touches the eyes. The kind that suggests he understood something I hadn't caught up to yet. As though the charged look that had just passed between me and Ruggiero was precisely what he'd been counting on. I barely had time to turn that over in my head before something in the air around us changed. Ruggiero was moving. He placed the glass on the counter without sparing it a glance, and cut across the ballroom in long, unhurried strides, the kind of walk that made bodies part by instinct. Every step devoured the space between us, as though the distance itself had offended him. He stopped directly in front of Ennio and me, and for one suspended moment the room forgot how to breathe. Then he took my hand. He drew it from Ennio's arm with a certainty that left no room for protest, and leaned close enough that his breath grazed the skin below my ear. You shouldn't have come with him, he murmured, so quietly that the words belonged only to me. My heart crashed against my ribs like something trying to break free. I reclaimed my hand with the same force he'd used to seize it, and locked my eyes on his. Those dark, unreadable eyes that had looked past me for 7 years, as though I simply did not exist. And you shouldn't have spent 7 years pretending I was invisible. Chapter 2. What the silence was hiding. It took Ruggiero Cavour exactly 3 days after the ball to decide that 7 years of pretending I didn't exist could be corrected by making himself unavoidable. On Monday, he appeared outside the restaurant where I always had lunch near the atelier. He didn't come inside. He leaned against a black car on the opposite side of the street, arms folded, studying the building's facade, the way a man surveys something he's considering buying. By the time I stepped out, he was already gone. But the owner approached me with a tight, uneasy smile and said that a man who was extremely courteous and extremely intimidating had wanted to know if I came in every day. On Wednesday, a colleague at the restoration atelier mentioned a peculiar phone call she'd received. Someone had asked about my schedule, about who came to see me, about how I'd been acting lately. She assumed it was a concerned family member. I knew better. By Thursday, the doorman at my building casually let slip that a black car had been parked on my street every night since the weekend. I didn't bother asking who it belonged to. Ruggiero wasn't looking out for me. He was circling. And the line between those two things was so razor thin, I could sense it in my bones without being able to name it. Ennio, meanwhile, chose the opposite strategy entirely. Flowers showed up at the atelier on Tuesday, not roses, which would have been obvious, but white peonies, my favorites, a detail I couldn't recall ever sharing with him. A dinner invitation arrived by phone on Wednesday, wrapped in that unhurried, golden voice of a man with nowhere else to be. Thursday brought a brief call, just to check how I was. No agenda, no pressure. Ennio was generous with his attention in a way Ruggiero had never been, warm, present, effortless in his affection, and that was precisely what unsettled me. In the Cavour world, nothing came without purpose. Everything had a calculation sewn into its lining, and tenderness was the preferred disguise of someone who stood to gain. I told Giada all of it over the phone, stretched across my apartment couch, shoes abandoned on the floor, my skull throbbing from too many thoughts chasing each other in circles. She listened without interrupting, which, for Giada, qualified as a meteorological event, and then exhaled, "So let me understand. The older one is surveilling you and the younger one is wooing you." A beat of silence. "Darling, this is either the start of a love story or a restraining order. Possibly both." I laughed in spite of everything. Giada had that rare ability to compress the unbearable into a single sentence, but once the laughter faded, the question I couldn't resolve was still sitting there, untouched. I wasn't choosing between Ennio and Ruggiero. I was choosing between what I deserved and what I craved, and the two refused to occupy the same space. Friday found me alone in the atelier. The building sat on a narrow lane in Palermo's old quarter, thick stone walls holding the air cool even through the worst of the Sicilian summer. I was bent over a 17th century altarpiece, painstaking restoration work that demanded silence and stable hands, two things I had in surplus when the rest of my existence wasn't unraveling. The place had been empty for more than an hour when I heard the door. No knock. It simply swung open with the casual authority of someone unaccustomed to requesting entry. Ruggiero filled the doorway and the entire room contracted around him. His sleeves were pushed up past his forearms, the first time I'd ever seen him without the suit jacket, and the detail threw me off balance more than it should have, as though those few inches of bare skin were a concession he rarely granted anyone. His gaze swept the space with the same deliberate assessment I'd watched him apply to crowded rooms full of powerful men. Only now, the room contained nothing but me. "You finished work an hour ago," he said, as if that were something he had every right to know. "And you know that because you've been watching me, or because you pulled my employment records?" I kept my eyes on the altarpiece. My hand stayed firm. My pulse didn't. He stepped inside and drew the door shut behind him, and the soft click of the latch sounded like punctuation at the end of a sentence neither of us had begun. The atelier was spacious, but with Ruggiero standing in it, the walls seemed to have drifted inward. He moved slowly, examining the canvases propped against the stone, the jars of solvent, the row of tools arranged across the workbench, looking at everything except me, until he stopped 2 meters from my table, and finally turned his full attention my way. The silence that hung between us had texture, dense, heated, edged. I set the brush down and faced him, because pretending his proximity hadn't rearranged the gravity in the room was a lie my body flatly refused to maintain. "What do you want, Ruggiero?" "To talk." "You don't talk. You issue commands and let the silence fill in the blanks." He nearly smiled. Nearly. The corner of his mouth shifted by a fraction, and I resented myself for noticing. "Fair point. I know." I folded my arms. "So what's different now?" He closed another step between us, near enough that I had to lift my chin to hold his gaze, far enough that the space still hummed with every unspoken thing crowding the air. "You walked in on my brother's arm," he said. His voice was low and measured, but something behind that control sounded close to fracturing. "In front of everyone, he invited me. You never did." The words landed. I watched his jaw tighten, watched his eyes darken by half a shade. Ruggiero Cavour was not a man who heard hard truths thrown at him often, and even less a man who found himself without a reply. "I had my reasons," he said, after a pause that lasted 3 of my heartbeats. "Reasons don't keep you warm, Ruggiero." The sentence escaped before I could weigh it, loaded with every night I'd spent turning over the question of what was so fundamentally wrong with me that this man could look through me as though I were made of nothing. All those winters at their family gatherings, standing in corners, pretending I wasn't scanning the crowd for his face, years spent trying to tear out the feeling he planted in me, and failing every single time. He looked at me as if I'd reached inside his chest and squeezed. For one long, suspended second, I thought he was about to say something that would rewrite everything, that he'd close the remaining distance and turn this quiet atelier into something else entirely. But the door opened. Tassilo walked in with the rigid bearing of a man half expecting to find overturned furniture. He'd been Roggiero's right hand since they were boys. A man of few words, relentless observation, and a bone-dry humor that surfaced at the most inconvenient moments. His eyes tracked from Roggiero to me, then back again, registering the negligible distance between us, and the expressions on our faces with the clinical precision of someone trained to assess volatile situations. "I'll wait in the car," he said, voice flat as slate. He left. 2 seconds later, the door cracked open again. Again, the door shut. Roggiero exhaled through his nose, something caught between frustration and surrender, and stepped back. Whatever had been turning the air between us into something combustible didn't vanish, but it lost its edge. He looked at me one final time, with an intensity I still couldn't tell was a promise or a warning, and walked out without another word. I stood in the middle of the atelier, heart hammering somewhere it didn't belong, my hands shaking for the first time in years. Giada called 20 minutes later. I told her everything, my back pressed against the cool stone wall, eyes closed. When I finished, she went quiet for 3 full seconds. A personal record. "Well," she said, her voice unusually gentle, "if reasons don't keep you warm, didn't hit him dead center, nothing ever will. Now go home, get in the shower, and stop reeking of turpentine. Tomorrow you can figure out what to do with the man who turned stalking into a courtship ritual." I hung up wearing a melancholy smile, locked the atelier, and walked home through central Palermo with the trace of him still caught in my memory like something half-spoken. The following evening, Ennio took me to dinner at a quiet place near the harbor. He was flawless, as always. Pale linen shirt, expensive watch, the grin of a man fully aware of his own appeal and skilled at wielding it like a master key. The conversation came easily. He asked about my work, about Palermo, about what I did when I wasn't mending things other people had allowed to fall apart. He was effortless company, dangerously so. Until, somewhere between one glass of wine and the next, Ennio shifted the tone with the surgical timing of someone who waits for the precise moment to flip the board. He mentioned, lightly, as if remarking on the breeze coming off the water, that he was aware of my father's blood debt. The glass froze halfway to my lips. The ambient noise of the restaurant dissolved. All that was left was his voice, smooth and unhurried, delivering words that carried the force of a landslide. "Don't worry," he said, expression unmoved, eyes steady on mine. "I can make it disappear." Chapter 3, Blood Debt. Sleep never came. Ennio's words orbited my skull like a coin tossed and never caught. I can make it disappear. And every time I tried to find an innocent reading of that sentence, I slammed into the same truth. Nobody in that world offers you a way out without expecting the door to swing their way. Not with that surname. Not in that life. The following morning, I went back to the restaurant where we'd dined. Ennio was already seated, as though he'd known I would show up, wearing the same pale shirt and the same imperturbable composure of a man who had lobbed a grenade the night before, and was now sitting back, perfectly at ease, watching for the debris. "You knew I'd come," I said, dropping into the chair across from him without waiting to be invited. "I was counting on it." He slid a cup of coffee toward me. "You're not someone who pretends she didn't hear what she heard." I left the coffee untouched. "Tell me everything." He laid it out with the patience of a professor and the precision of an attorney. My father's debt to the Cavouri family was old, contracted before I'd even reached my teens and never repaid. Under the family's internal code, a set of rules that existed nowhere on paper but carried more authority than any signed contract, that debt was the equivalent of a life. It had never been enforced, but it had never been pardoned either. It hung over me like a permanent shadow, an invisible leash that any member of the family could jerk whenever they saw fit. "And the way out?" I asked, my voice holding steadier than the rest of me. "Marriage." He said the word the way you'd say rain or Thursday. To me, the debt gets absorbed by the union. You'd be free, shielded, a member of the family by bond rather than by obligation. The air emptied from my chest as if something heavy had been dropped on it. I studied Ennio, those warm brown eyes that radiated such conviction it ached, and I hunted for the catch. It was there. I could feel its shape, but he concealed it so expertly I couldn't lay a finger on it. "I'll think about it," I said, a lie, and left before he could add another word. I called Giada from the car and spilled everything. When I finished, she exhaled like she'd taken a blow to the stomach. Her voice came back charged with a fury I could feel pulsing through the speaker. "Isotta, Hear me clearly. You do not marry someone to settle a ledger. This isn't a love story. It's a business deal. And you are not merchandise. I knew she was right. But knowing and feeling occupy different rooms. And in that moment, I felt every ounce of 24 years lived beneath a cloud I never chose, and that showed no sign of lifting. That same afternoon, I went to see Severo. The Cavouri family's consigliere was a man in his early 70s, voice like gravel, eyes shaped by decades of watching empires rise and crumble inside the same room. He received me in an office that smelled of aged paper and decisions no one could undo, and he listened to my questions with the calm of a man who already knew what I was going to ask before I opened my mouth. The debt is real, he confirmed, as lightly as if he were reading off a menu. It stands. Who holds it? Severo looked away, the first time his gaze had left mine since I'd entered. That's a question for the boss. The answer was a locked door, but the averted eyes were a hairline crack, and I stored it in the same place I kept every truth the men in that family tried to shield from me, at the back of my mind, with the patience of someone who understood that every secret eventually surfaces when the right silence finally breaks. I drove to the Cavouri estate outside Catania, with the sun dissolving behind the hills, and a resolve burning through my chest like a low fever. I needed answers, and only one person could provide them. But before I reached Ruggiero, I crossed paths with Donna Silvia. The matriarch stood in the corridor leading to her son's office, positioned as though she'd happened to be passing. But nothing about Donna Silvia Cavouri was accidental. She looked me over from head to toe with that blade-edged courtesy I already recognized, and when she spoke, each word landed like a stone being laid on a coffin. "You are not a boss's wife," she said, never raising her voice. "You are the daughter of a man who died in debt. Do not mistake attention for standing." The words entered like knives, one after another, sliding between my ribs. I felt each syllable pierce something I had spent my entire life shielding, that fragile, defiant conviction that I was more than what my father owed. Donna Silvia didn't linger for a response. She turned and continued down the hall with the poise of someone who'd just trimmed a branch she considered worthless. I stood there for 3 seconds, drew a breath, then pushed open the door to Ruggiero's office without knocking. He was on his feet behind the desk, documents fanned out before him, wearing the expression of a man burdened by choices that wrecked lives. When he saw me, something shifted in his face, a softening so fleeting I would have missed it if I hadn't been watching with such desperate attention. "My father's debt," I said. No greeting, no formality, none of the decorum that world expected. "Who owns it?" Ruggiero held my gaze, and held it. The silence stretched between us like a wire about to snap, and I endured every second of it, because if 7 years of invisibility had taught me anything, it was how to outlast any silence this man chose to inflict. "I do," he said, and the 2 words dropped through the air like a sentence handed down. My knees threatened to give, but I refused to sit. I would not grant him the satisfaction of watching me collapse. I stayed upright, spine rigid, heart fracturing, absorbing the full weight of what he'd just told me. Ruggiero Cavouri had acquired my father's debt. Years ago, without a word, he had held the chain capable of destroying me for 7 years, and had never once pulled it, never collected, never spoken of it. He had ignored me for 7 years, looked through me as though I cast no shadow, and the entire time, he was the one holding the document that said my life was owed to someone. The rage climbed my throat, tasting of iron. This wasn't the polished anger from the ball, or the sharp-edged anger from the atelier. This was something far deeper, the kind of fury born when you realize the person who wounded you most is the same one who quietly kept you standing, and you never knew. I opened my mouth, but nothing I could say measured up to what I felt. So I did the only thing left. I turned around and walked out. In the corridor, Ennio was leaning against the wall, arms folded, wearing the expression of a man watching a play, whose final act he'd already read. He looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, but carried the unmistakable scent of strategy. "Now you see," he said, his voice gentle, "why I offered you another way out." Chapter 4. What no one was supposed to see. I sealed myself off. Not just the apartment. I sealed off everything. I stopped answering Ruggiero, stopped answering Ennio, told the atelier I wouldn't be in, and spent 2 days on the couch with the curtains pulled shut, and a fury so dense it seemed to thicken the air around me. Giada was the sole exception. She turned up at my door the first night, carrying a bottle of wine, and zero intention of leaving me to myself. She sat on the living room floor beside me, filled 2 glasses, and waited. When I finally spoke, the words didn't come out in any sensible order. They came in fragments, Jagged pieces I dropped between us on the floor, and Giada gathered them one by one, in silence, without trying to force the picture together before I was finished. "The worst part isn't what he did," I said, staring into the glass, as though it held the answer somewhere at the bottom. "The worst part is not knowing whether I should hate him or thank him, and feeling both at once is tearing me apart." Giada was quiet for a moment, rotating the glass slowly between her fingers. Then, in the most solemn tone I had ever heard from her, "It could be protection. It could be control. And that's what makes it terrifying, Isata. Because when one act can be either thing, you never know what you're standing on." She was right. And the not knowing was worse than any definitive answer would have been, because an answer at least had shape. I could despise him or absolve him, and both roads offered clarity. But this purgatory between gratitude and rage, was the kind of place a person could remain trapped in forever. While I hid, Ennio moved. I learned the details later through Giada. He had convened a meeting with family allies and formally put forward his intention to marry me as a resolution to the debt. He transformed a private matter into a political maneuver, made the proposal public and impossible to set aside. Donna Silvia endorsed it. Severo held his tongue, and in that family, silence was consent dressed as neutrality. In under 48 hours, my life had become an item on an agenda at a table where no one had ever offered me a seat. Ruggiero found out. His response was the kind you measure only by the damage left behind. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call a counter-meeting. He didn't confront Ennio openly. He did what men like him do when anger sinks past the surface. He acted without sound. Ennio's contracts were voided. Men who had reported to the younger brother were quietly reassigned. Access to family accounts and contacts was cut, one thread at a time, with the surgical calm of someone dismantling a mechanism piece by piece. The war between the brothers stopped being personal. It became structural, and I stood at the center of it, without ever having chosen to be there. On the third night, I couldn't bear it any longer. The rage had shifted form. It was no longer the paralytic kind, but the kind that propels. I needed to face Ruggiero and hear, without evasion and without silence, why he had done what he'd done. I drove to the estate with my jaw locked and my chest ablaze. He was in the study, same desk, same scattered papers, but something had changed. His collar undone one button past his usual discipline, his eyes carrying the hollowness of someone who hadn't slept, a glass of whiskey near his hand that clearly wasn't the first. When I entered, he looked up and something crossed his face. Relief, perhaps, or a ghost of it, before the mask fell back into position. "You vanished," he said. "You lied," I answered. "For 7 years. I didn't lie. I withheld. When the silence weighs that much, it's the same thing." He stepped out from behind the desk and moved to the window, turning his back to me. I could see the strain in his shoulders, the fist that formed at his side, fingers tightening as though gripping something threatening to slip away. "Why did you buy the debt?" I asked, and my voice came out lower than I meant it to, as if the question was too heavy to carry at full volume. "Isata, why?" He turned, and what I saw on his face stopped the air in my lungs. It wasn't the practiced coldness he wore like armor. It wasn't the unbreakable poise of the Kavuri patriarch. It was something fractured, a thin, deep crack running across his composure like a fissure in a dam moments from giving way. "Because if any other man had bought it," he said, voice raw, each word weighed as though it cost him something irreplaceable, "you wouldn't be standing here. You'd be in a house you didn't choose, carrying a name you didn't want, living a life that was never yours." The sentence struck me with the force of something I hadn't braced for. The truth. Bare, unpolished, stripped of every layer of protocol that family wrapped around everything. I felt the burn behind my eyes and bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to keep the tears in place, because I would not cry in front of him. "Not here, not yet. And what you did was any different?" I asked, my voice cracking on the last word. "You kept me trapped without telling me. That isn't protection, Ruggiero. It's just a different cage." The blow connected. I saw it in his eyes, which shut for a beat, and in his jaw, which clamped down with the force of someone swallowing a truth that won't go down. When he opened his eyes again, the fissure had widened. The silence that settled between us needed no words, because the words had already done their damage. Ruggiero took a step toward me, then another. I didn't retreat, not out of courage, but because my body flatly refused to move away from him, even as everything inside me screamed that it should. He stopped close enough that I felt his warmth crossing the gap between us like a current. Then slowly, he lowered his head until his forehead came to rest against mine. His eyes were closed. His breath met my lips, warm and uneven, and I caught the woody scent of his skin layered with something that felt like exhaustion, as if maintaining his distance for 7 years had cost him a price I had never thought to calculate. "I know," he whispered, and those 2 words held everything he'd never said. Regret, want, fear, surrender, all compressed into 2 syllables that vibrated against my skin like a confession. I nearly gave in, nearly raised my hand and touched his face, nearly closed my eyes and let the moment become something else, something I wanted so fiercely it ached down to the bone. But before nearly could turn into anything real, the door opened. It opened without warning. Tassilo halted in the frame, and his eyes absorbed the scene. Foreheads pressed together, no distance remaining, the air between us dense enough to cut, with the trained speed of a man who had long ago learned to process what he witnessed without visible reaction. But this time something sat on his face that I hadn't seen before. Urgency. "Boss," he said, and his voice had lost its usual flat register. It was taut, like a line stretched to the point of snapping. "Ennio is in the hall. He brought a priest." The world froze. Ruggiero pulled back from me as though the words had been a gunshot, and in his eyes I glimpsed something I had never seen there before. Genuine shock. He looked at Tassilo, then at me, and the crack in his expression sealed itself in an instant, replaced by something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. Ennio had forced the hand. He'd arrived at the family mansion with a priest and witnesses, ready to formalize a commitment to me in front of everyone. And Ruggiero, the man who controlled every variable, who mapped every move before making it, who was never caught unprepared, was being boxed in by his own brother. I looked at Ruggiero, and for the first time since I'd known him, I could not read what he would do next. He could follow protocol and lose me, or he could shatter everything and claim what he felt. And while he decided, I stood there in the middle of the study, struck by a single searing realization. My future had just been placed in the hands of 2 warring brothers, and neither one had thought to ask me what I wanted. Chapter 5. In front of everyone. The great hall of the Cavouri mansion had been arranged like a tribunal dressed as a ceremony. Chairs formed a semicircle, family members seated with the rigid posture of people who understand they are about to witness something irreversible, and at the center of it all, standing, a priest at his side, wearing the polished composure of a man who had spent days engineering every detail of the scene before drawing the curtain. Ennio Cavouri smiled as though the world had already ruled in his favor, and all that remained was my consent. I hadn't been called for a ceremony. The message read, "Formal meeting regarding the debt," and Tassilo had delivered it to my apartment door in Palermo that morning. He stood in the hallway a beat longer than necessary, the envelope suspended between us like something he wasn't certain he should be handing over. There was something behind his eyes. Not quite hesitation. Something more precise. The look of a man who knows far more than he's revealing, and has chosen to say just enough to let his conscience sleep at night. His mouth opened, closed, and then he offered only, "Read it carefully." I mistook it for formality. It wasn't. I dressed simply, pinned up my hair, and drove to the estate outside Catania with steady hands and a knotted stomach, believing I was heading to a table covered in documents where I would hear terms I could accept or reject, with the dignity of someone who still had a choice. When I entered the hall and saw the priest with his stole neatly in place, the chairs arranged like an audience, the faces angled toward me with the expectation of people watching a performance whose ending was already written, and Ennio's burnished smile gleaming at the center of it all like a display window, the floor began to dissolve beneath me, not suddenly, gradually, with the deliberate smoothness of a trap engineered to resemble an invitation. Donna Silvia occupied the chair at the right of the front row. The matriarch was flawless as ever, dark dress, hair swept up, hands resting in her lap with the tranquility of a woman who had never once needed to raise her voice to command obedience. The family signet ring caught the candlelight on her finger, the crowned lion clutching a dagger between its jaws, a quiet reminder that this world operated by rules, and those rules had not been drafted by people like me. Her posture radiated endorsement, not eagerly, with the settled ease of someone observing the natural order confirming itself. Ennio took 2 steps in my direction. His smile was generous, inviting, and his voice carried the gentleness of someone presenting a gift he had spent weeks perfecting. "Isotta," he said, opening his arms in a gesture that appeared welcoming, but functioned as a boundary. "Thank you for coming." "I came for a meeting about the debt," I said, my voice tighter than I intended, because my body had already identified the danger before my mind caught up. "And that's precisely what this is." he replied, turning to the room with the confidence of a man who owns the stage and has no plans to share it. Ennio spoke with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed every pause. He presented the marriage as the most honorable resolution to a debt that, in his telling, should never have fallen on my shoulders. He deployed the right words: tradition, honor, protection, union, and placed them with the care of a jeweler arranging stones, each one angled to catch the light at just the right spot to persuade. My father's blood debt would be dissolved by the marital bond. I would enter the Cavouri family by right, with formal guarantees. The shadow that had trailed me since adolescence would lift inside a ceremony that, he said, could take place within 30 days. "What I propose is straightforward," he declared, addressing the room with the authority of a man who trusts his own script entirely. "The marriage extinguishes the debt, aligns interests, and upholds the tradition that has sustained this family for generations. Isotta ceases to be a debtor's daughter and becomes a Cavouri wife. The debt dies. The honor endures." Donna Silvia inclined her head. The movement was slight, almost invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the weight each gesture from that woman carried. But I understood. That nod was a ruling. The matriarch had granted her approval, and in the Cavouri world, Donna Silvia's blessing was the second most powerful force after the boss himself. I scanned the room. Every face delivered the same message, packaged in varying degrees of courtesy, except, "This is proper. This is expected. This is what women in your position do." They thank the exit offered to them and stop creating complications. "What are the terms?" I asked, because stalling was the only weapon available while the ground kept giving way. Ennio answered with patience. He outlined timelines, conditions, formalities, reciting them with the cadence of someone reading contract clauses aloud. And that was exactly what this was. A contract outfitted with a white dress, and a priest standing in for a notary. And if I refuse? The room went quieter than I thought possible. The air itself seemed to condense, as though every person present had drawn a breath and held it at the same instant. Ennio tilted his head with the patient grace of someone explaining the obvious to a person who, out of politeness, is pretending not to see it. "The debt stands, Isotta, and the current holder can collect whenever he chooses, however he chooses." The threat sat beneath the silk of his tone, woven in with the elegance Ennio applied to everything, including things that deserved to be said with the bluntness they warranted. Family members exchanged glances, and I could read in those looks the same consensus. The outcome had already been settled. I was the only person in the room who hadn't yet grasped that my opinion was ornamental. I looked toward the main door, the tall dark wood door that opened onto the mansion's central corridor, through which I had watched Ruggiero enter and exit dozens of times over the years, with his weighted stride and the expression of a man shouldering the world without requesting help. The door was shut. He was not there. The emptiness that opened in my chest was not surprise. It was confirmation, the specific pain that arrives when you brace for the worst, hope you're mistaken, and discover you were right from the start. Ruggiero hadn't come. The man who pressed his forehead to mine and whispered, "I know." The man who acquired my debt to shield me. The man who crossed an entire ballroom to pull my hand from his brother's arm. That man was absent, and his absence spoke louder than anything Ennio could say. I opened my mouth without knowing what would emerge. A refusal, a question, or the kind of silence that concedes defeat without needing words. The priest regarded me with conscientious sympathy. Donna Silvia watched me with the patience of someone awaiting the inevitable, and Ennio looked at me with the settled confidence of a man who had already won. That was when the side door crashed open. Not literally, but the force with which it struck the wall produced the same effect. Giada burst into the hall as though the building were ablaze, and she were the only person with enough sense to run toward the right exit. Her dark hair was loose and untamed, her breathing ragged, and her eyes blazed with the kind of fury that only surfaces in someone who loves another person enough to do reckless things without a moment's pause. Tassilo had alerted her. I knew it from the glance Giada cast toward the doorway as she crossed the room. A brief flash of recognition, the look you exchange with a co-conspirator, and the realization struck me in the middle of my relief, like a pebble lodged in a shoe. The same man who placed the invitation in my hands, knowing what awaited me inside, was the man who called Giada so she could come pull me out. He could have warned me directly. He could have told me the truth at my door that morning instead of letting me walk into this room expecting paperwork. But he chose a path that shielded my friend, shielded himself, and left me to step into the trap blindfolded. I stored that alongside everything else that didn't yet make sense. Deep down, with patience, waiting for the moment the piece would click into a picture I still couldn't see. Giada ignored every important face in the room. She strode past territory captains as if they were street furniture. She crossed in front of Donna Silvia without dropping her gaze, and she planted herself at my side with the solidity of a fortress built from vintage textiles, an unfiltered tongue, and a loyalty no fortune on earth could purchase. "If you say yes to this farce," she whispered against my ear, her grip on my arm tight enough to bruise, "I will haul you out of here myself." My eyes burned. The knot in my throat clenched with a force that nearly buckled my knees, not from fear, not from sorrow, but from relief, the shattering relief of discovering that in the center of a room saturated with power and protocol, where my name was debated like a clause and my future bartered like goods, someone had come for me, not out of self-interest, not out of tactics, not out of obligation. Giada was there because I belonged to her, and she to me. In the simplest and most unbreakable way, two people can belong to each other. No ring, no contract, nothing but the decision to show up when everything is falling apart. I returned her grip, and then the main door opened. Ruggiero did not rush in. He made no speech. He announced nothing with words or grand gestures. He simply opened the door and walked through it, and the entire room reconfigured around him, as though gravity had found a new center. Family members corrected their posture before they were conscious of doing it. The priest retreated half a step, pressing himself against the wall with the quiet urgency of a man moving away from the core of something he cannot name, but whose body recognizes as peril. Donna Silvia narrowed her eyes with the precision of a blade turning in the light, measuring, calculating, deciding whether what she saw constituted a threat or merely defiance. Ennio went still, and for the first time since I'd entered, the edges of his smile faltered. Ruggiero did not look at me. He did not look at his mother, at the priest, at the rows of important men pretending they were present out of tradition rather than appetite. He walked directly to his brother and stopped with less than a meter between them, and the contrast between the two had never been so stark. The brothers locked eyes, and the silence that hung between them was the kind that precedes words no one can retract. Ennio held the stare, and I understood the nerve that required, because meeting Ruggiero Cavouri's gaze in that state was like facing down a blaze and trusting the wall would hold. Ruggiero's voice was low, but the silence in the hall was so total that every syllable reached every ear as clearly as if he had shouted across an empty piazza. "She is not marrying you, the debt is mine, the decision is mine, and the answer is no." Nobody breathed. I saw Donna Silvia's fingers close around the arm of her chair, with the force of someone physically holding her own composure together. I saw Severo shut his eyes for an instant, the minimal reflex of a man who hears the first fracture of a collapse and already knows there is no point in running. I saw the priest glance at the door with the transparent expression of someone gauging the distance to the nearest exit and concluding it was too far. Ennio did not lose the smile, but its quality shifted, from cordial to keen, from warm to edged, like a blade flipped to the side that cuts. "The answer belongs to her, brother," he said, pivoting toward me with a broad, theatrical sweep of his arm, as if returning something Ruggiero had tried to seize. Both of them looked at me. The entire room looked at me, and I felt the pressure of those gazes like lead, on my shoulders, my chest, my legs, every part of me that wanted to surrender, to sit down, to let someone else decide, because it would have been so much easier, so much simpler to nod, sign the paper, take the name, and let the current carry me wherever it would. It was what every person in that room expected. It was what tradition demanded. It was what women in my position had done since that world began. Thank the exit and close their mouths. Giada squeezed my hand, brief, firm, asking for nothing and offering everything. "I am your anchor. You are not alone. Do what you need to do." I looked at Ennio, at the man extending an exit that was a prison wrapped in a prettier name, who had turned my debt into currency and my body into collateral. He returned my gaze with something that, in another setting, might have passed for genuine warmth. But here, in this room staged like a theater, it was merely another instrument in the service of an ambition he dressed in courtesy, and I looked at Ruggiero. He stood 3 meters from me, bearing the same posture as always, but there was something in his shoulders I had never witnessed, a tension that was not authority, it was waiting. His eyes were different too. No commands lived in them, no calculation, no fortified coldness I knew so well I had mistaken it for indifference for years. What I found there was something that pulled the ground from beneath me in a way nothing else in that room had managed. vulnerability, unguarded, exposed, defenseless, the silent dread of a man who, for the first time in his life, was not steering the outcome. He was surrendered to it. He was waiting, and the waiting was costing him more than any battle he had ever fought. Ruggiero Cavouri, the boss, the name, the man who silenced entire rooms without parting his lips, stood before me with his chest open and no armor, waiting for me to determine his fate with a single word. And in that impossible reversal of power, I grasped something he had perhaps understood for a long time, that love is not the opposite of control. It is its surrender. I drew a deep breath. The air entered my lungs as though it were the first in hours, and it carried with it a clarity I hadn't anticipated. Sharp, clean, purged of the anger that had fueled me until now, and free of the fear that had paralyzed me before. What remained was something simpler and stronger than either: certainty. I knew who I was. I was not currency. I was not a clause. I was not a debtor's daughter or a piece in a game two brothers were contesting as though I were ground to be claimed. I was Isolde Ferry, a woman who restored what others had allowed to break, who upheld her own dignity with bare hands, and who was standing, alone, at the center of a room filled with powerful men who had no idea what to do with someone who refused to fit the space they had carved out for her. "My father's debt does not belong to me," I said, and my voice emerged steady in a way that startled even me, as if the words drew from roots deeper than I knew, nourished by 24 years of silences swallowed whole, and dignity held together by sheer force. "And I am no one's bargaining chip." The pause that followed was mine. I built it, and held it suspended for as long as I needed, because this was the first moment in my life when the silence in that room belonged to me, and I was not giving it back before I was ready. "But if I'm going to be with someone," I continued, turning my gaze to Ruggiero, "it will be with whoever I choose, on my terms, not yours." The hall held its breath. I held Ruggiero's stare, those dark eyes that had avoided me for years, and now looked at me as though I were the only thing in the world he could not bear to lose. And I spoke in a voice low enough to be intimate, and steady enough to be final. "On my terms, Ruggiero." He looked at me for a stretch of time that seemed to contain everything we had never said. And when he answered, his voice was rough, low, and carried the weight of a surrender that had cost him more than any war. "On your terms." Chapter 6. What remained after. The room did not erupt. There was no shouting, no applause, none of the dramatic upheaval that pivotal moments seem to require. What followed was quieter and far more devastating, a recalibration. Every person in that hall processing, in real time, what they had just witnessed. The head of the Cavouri family, the man who did not bend, did not yield, and did not accept terms he hadn't drafted himself, had just submitted to the conditions of a woman who, by every rule of that world, should never have had a voice at all. Donna Silvia rose. The movement was unhurried, precise, carrying the measured economy of a woman who had spent a lifetime calibrating every gesture by the weight of its consequence. She did not look at me. She did not look at Ruggiero. She walked toward the exit with her usual blade-edged elegance and her spine straight as a column, and every footfall on the marble sounded like a sentence deferred, not withdrawn. Ennio absorbed the humiliation with a locked jaw, and eyes drained of everything except arithmetic. The smile had disappeared, and what sat in its place was the stripped expression of a man who had lost a battle and was already sketching the terrain for the next. He adjusted a shirt cuff with a mechanical flick, dismissed the priest with the curt nod you give a hired hand, and departed through the side door without a backward glance. The manner of his leaving unsettled me more than any words could have, because rage I would have known how to meet. Ennio's deliberate, calibrated silence was something else entirely. Severo released the breath he appeared to have been holding through the entire scene. He looked at Ruggiero, then at me, and across the consigliere's weathered face, past something I never expected to see there. Relief. Subtle, almost sheepish in its own presence, but unmistakable, in the softening at the corners of his eyes, in the loosening of his shoulders, in the way he settled both hands on his cane and drew a long breath like a man who had just watched a vessel clear a storm without going under. When the room emptied, Giada seized me. It was not a gentle embrace. It was the kind that nearly takes you off your feet, that grips too hard, that compresses your ribs and forces the air from your lungs along with everything you had been holding inside. I felt her shoulders trembling and realized she was crying before I was, which, knowing Giada, made complete sense, because she always experienced my emotions with an intensity I would not permit myself. "You just refused an entire family," she whispered against my shoulder, her voice cracking and pride spilling through every damp syllable. "I have never been so proud of you." I laughed, a short, unsteady, wet laugh that came out closer to relief than happiness, because happiness was too layered to fit into that moment. It would arrive later, in fragments, once I'd had time to absorb the scale of what I had done. I held her face between my hands and said, "Thank you for showing up." "Always," she answered, with that fierce simplicity that made Giada the most important person in my life, before any Kavori, before any debt, before any man who imagined his love was the axis of my story. She pulled back, smearing tears away with the heel of her hand, muttered something about needing an entire bottle of wine and a month somewhere free of dangerous Italians, and left through the side door with the imperfect, beautiful dignity of someone who had cried in public and felt no shame about it. And I remained standing at the center of an empty hall that smelled of extinguished candles and irreversible decisions, the sound of my own pulse loud in my ears, and the unfamiliar sensation that the ground beneath my feet, for the first time in a very long while, was mine. Ruggiero approached, not with the broad, commanding stride of a man who crosses rooms the way he claims territory. His steps were slower, more deliberate, as though the space between us were delicate and any careless movement could shatter what we had just built. "You came," I said, and my voice emerged softer than I intended, as if the relief of finding him there had dissolved the last layer of defense I was still carrying. "I almost didn't," he answered, and the bare honesty of those words struck harder than any comfortable lie would have. "Why not?" He stopped before me, near enough that his warmth reached me across the remaining gap, far enough that the distance still carried meaning, the last measure of a pride he was teaching himself to release. Because showing up meant choosing, and choosing meant losing things I've spent my whole life building. His gaze moved across my face with the slow attentiveness of someone committing something to memory, out of fear it might vanish. But staying away meant losing you. And I discovered, standing on the other side of that door, that nothing I've ever protected is worth that. The air between us shifted. The tension that had sustained the room, political, familial, public, dissolved like smoke, and what remained in its place was something more dangerous and more intimate. The current that had existed between Ruggiero and me from the start, that required no audience to hum, and that neither of us had managed to kill no matter how relentlessly we tried. I didn't reply with words. I didn't need to. Because for the first time since I had known Ruggiero Kavori, we occupied the same ground. Not because of debt, not because of duty, not because of protocol, by choice. His and mine, imperfect, terrifying, and entirely ours. We walked out together through the main door. The Sicilian night was warm, carrying that thick heat that clings to the skin and holds the scent of jasmine from the gardens, and the salt the wind pulls inland from the distant sea. The estate's lights scattered across the hills like fireflies pinned to the earth, and the muted hum of voices from inside the mansion drifted out like the echo of a world still rearranging itself after what had taken place. We moved side by side through the torchlit garden, and the silence between us was unlike any we had ever shared. It was not the silence he wielded as a wall. It was not the silence I wore as a shield. It was a silence that belonged to both of us, still uncertain, still crowded with things that needed saying, but for the first time unburdened by the weight of a lie, holding everything together, until he stopped. He turned to face me, and the glow of a nearby torch lit one half of his face while the other half fell into shadow, which, when I thought about it, was the most truthful portrait of Ruggiero Kavori anyone could ask for. "Do you want to know the truth?" he asked, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before. Fear, not the fear of a man who faces adversaries or negotiates borders, the fear of a man about to lay himself open before someone, and uncertain whether what she finds will be enough. All of it. The warm breeze drifted between us, carrying the scent of the lemon trees, and sweeping away the last traces of the hall, the priest, the chairs, and the rules. I looked at him, at the dark eyes that had looked past me for 7 years, and now fixed on me as though I were the answer to a question he was terrified to ask. And I answered with the only thing I had demanded of him from the very beginning, the one thing he had never given. It's the only thing that's been missing. Chapter 7. The Silence That Speaks. The Kavori estate had a terrace I had never seen after dark. It perched on the eastern face of the mansion, suspended above a gentle slope of olive trees that descended to where the land surrendered to the sea, and from there the coast of Catania glimmered in the distance like a constellation that had fallen to earth. Ruggiero led me there without a word, climbing a narrow stone staircase that seemed designed for a single body at a time. So he went first and I followed, and during those 30 steps, I studied his back and thought that this was the man who had just chosen me over his own family, and that I still had no idea what to do with the magnitude of that. The terrace was spare, aged stone, a low wall softened by moss, 2 iron chairs that looked as if they had been there since before any cavalry drew breath. An almost full moon drenched everything in a pale blue light that lifted the place out of time entirely. Ruggiero braced both hands against the wall and stared out at the water. I stayed 1 step behind him, arms folded across my chest, my heart hammering at a pace I could not slow. The silence between us was dense but not hostile, the kind that settles when 2 people understand that the next words will alter everything, and neither wants to go first. He did. When I bought the debt, 3 men were competing for the right to collect it, he said, eyes still on the sea. His voice was low, stripped of the authority I was accustomed to, as though he had shed the armor and was standing in whatever lay beneath. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. 2 of them would have used you as payment. His jaw tightened around the word payment, as if it burned his mouth. The 3rd intended to sell the debt to the Ferrante, the family that controls the port of Messina and sees no distinction between people and cargo. The outcome would have been the same. I already know you bought it, I said. What I don't know is why you vanished afterward. He turned to face me, and the moonlight fell across him without mercy. Because if anyone discovered what I felt for you, they would weaponize it. The sentence dropped between us like a stone into still water. I felt its ripples moving through me, reaching places I had sealed years ago. You pulled away, I repeated, and what surfaced in my voice was not a question. It was an indictment. His words still hung. Feeling is information. Information is a weapon. I heard everyone, registered everyone, and still their meaning took time to break through the wall of anger and wounded pride I had constructed as defense against exactly this man. So you ignored me, I said, for 7 years, to protect me, to keep you alive, and you thought that was enough? My voice fractured on the final syllable, and I despised the fracture, because I did not want him to see the full extent of the damage. But the crack was already exposed, and there was nothing to be gained by pretending otherwise. You thought keeping me alive and keeping me invisible amounted to the same thing. Ruggiero did not answer immediately. He stood there, looking at me with an intensity I could feel on my skin like radiant heat, and in his eyes I found something that disarmed me more than any explanation could. He knew. He knew he had been wrong. He knew that his protection had cost me 7 years of doubt, of solitude, of nights spent awake turning over the question of what was so fundamentally flawed in me that this man could look through me as though I were made of air. He knew all of it, and the weight of that knowledge was branded on him like an open wound. Every time I ignored you, he said, his voice so low I had to lean closer to catch the words. I came back to this terrace. I stood right here, watching the sea, telling myself that one day, when the world around me was safe enough, I would find you and say everything. I would look into your eyes and tell you that every silence was a choice that cost me more than any war I ever fought. The warm breeze lifted a strand of hair across my face. Before I could brush it aside, Ruggiero's hand moved, slowly, as though seeking permission from his own body to do something he had forbidden himself for years. His fingers caught the strand and tucked it behind my ear with a tenderness that seemed mismatched with the size of those hands, and the contact of his skin against mine ignited something at the base of my spine that climbed like an electric current to the nape of my neck. He did not pull away. His fingertips trailed down the side of my face, following the line of my jaw with a deliberateness that felt like cartography, as if he were finally touching something he had memorized from a distance for years. His thumb came to rest at the corner of my mouth, and the pressure was so faint I could almost convince myself it wasn't there. Almost. I lost 7 years, I said, and my voice came out as a thread I barely recognized. 7 years that could have been hours. I know. I thought you didn't see me. I saw everything, he answered, and the gravity of that sentence crashed over me like a wave. I saw when you arrived at the balls and pretended you weren't searching for me. I saw when you laughed with other people, and the smile never reached your eyes. I saw when you left early, because you couldn't stand being in the same room without me looking at you. I saw every moment, Isotta, and every one of them destroyed me a little more. The anger didn't vanish, but it changed form. It stopped being the dry, cutting anger of someone who had been dismissed, and became something more layered, deeper, and infinitely more painful. The anger of someone who understands that lost time cannot be recovered, that wasted years cannot be rewritten, and that the man before her had suffered as deeply as she had, only in silence, because silence was the only language he knew for saying "I love you" without putting her at risk. "Don't ignore me again," I said, and it was not a request. It was the condition, the line I was drawing between us with every ounce of authority I possessed. Authority he had accepted, minutes earlier, in front of an entire room. "Never again," he answered, and the two words carried the gravity of a vow. I should have said more. Should have pressed for more questions, extracted more answers, extended the conversation until every shadow of the past 7 years had been illuminated and examined. But my body had stopped obeying reason. My body answered only to the warmth of his hand still resting against my face, to the closeness that had grown unbearable in a way that was not pain. It was pain's opposite. The gravity of two people who had resisted each other for far too long, and who now, at last, were too exhausted to keep fighting. He kissed me, or I kissed him. I could not say who moved first, because the distance between us collapsed like something that should have happened years ago, not with urgency, not with desperation, but with the slow inevitability of a thing already written that both of us had spent years trying to erase and never could. His mouth met mine with a softness that surprised me, because I had expected force, expected the same unrelenting intensity he brought to everything in his life. But it was not that. It was surrender, the mouth of a man who had finally stopped warring against the one thing he had never been able to govern. His hand slid from my face to the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair with a firmness that tilted my head back. The kiss shifted, gained weight, gained heat, gained the kind of hunger that is born when you deny yourself something for years, and the dam at last gives way. I tasted him, warm, carrying a trace of wine he must have drunk before walking into that hall to do the bravest thing I had ever seen a man do. His hands fell to my waist and drew me against him, and the impact, the solid warmth of his chest flush with mine, the strength of the arms closing around me, the deep woody scent of his skin saturating every breath, knocked me off balance in a way that was not physical. It was as though the ground had dissolved and I was falling, but the fall was into him. He pressed me back against the terrace wall, and the cool stone behind me met the searing heat of his body in a contrast that pulled a sound from me, low, involuntary, escaping before I could catch it. Rogero paused. He drew his mouth from mine by barely an inch, just enough to search my eyes with an intensity I felt in my bones. "If you want to stop," he said, voice rough and breathing uneven, "say it now, because soon I won't be able to." I looked at him, at the eyes that had avoided me for 7 years, and now fixed on me with a hunger that was not merely physical, it was existential, the gaze of a man who has found the only thing in the world that makes sense and is terrified it will vanish. "I waited 7 years, I answered, my hand flat against his chest, feeling his heart slam beneath my palm, with a violence that made a mockery of every second of composure he pretended to possess. "Don't ask me to stop now." The sound he made was not a word. It was something between relief and capitulation, a low rumble that started in his chest, and that I felt against my hand before he kissed me again, this time without the earlier gentleness. His mouth claimed mine with an urgency that pressed me harder into the wall, and his hands traveled up my back with a firmness that was command and plea at once. I gripped his shoulders, broad, taut, vibrating with the effort of a man holding himself back and simultaneously refusing to stop, and pulled his body into mine, because every remaining fraction of distance between us was intolerable. His fingers found the strap of my dress and eased it from my shoulder with an agonizing slowness, rough fingertips against bare skin, every fiber of him reined in by a willpower running dry. I felt his mouth descend along my neck, warm and unhurried, tracing a line of restrained fire that lit every nerve in its path. His lips grazed, pressed, and withdrew in a precise rhythm, exploring the sensitive arc of my throat, lingering where the pulse beat hardest, as though he wanted to memorize the racing tempo of my blood. His breath on my skin made me arch into him in a way I neither controlled nor tried to. His lips paused at the curve where neck met shoulder, and he stayed, breathing against my skin, hands steady on my waist, his entire body pressed to mine with an intensity I registered at every point of contact. His hips moved against me in a slow, deliberate cadence, a subtle and constant pressure that sent deep waves of warmth through my center, a veiled friction that promised more without ever hurrying the moment. Every movement was measured, as if he intended to draw out the discovery, letting our bodies learn each other through the thin layers of fabric that still lay between us. All that time, he murmured against my skin, and the words vibrated like a confession. All that time forcing myself away from you. I didn't know it was possible to miss someone who was never mine. I closed my eyes and threaded my fingers through his hair, feeling its texture beneath my hands and the heat of his scalp and the way he leaned into my touch, as if that small gesture were the most significant thing anyone had ever offered him. And I thought that this was the most powerful man in Sicily, the man who silenced rooms with a single look. And here he was, mouth against my neck and body trembling against mine, completely undone by an art restorer he had pretended not to see for years. The surrender was not sudden. It was a tide, slow, inexorable, each wave cresting higher than the last, each touch dissolving a layer of resistance that no longer had any reason to stand. It was not explicit, it was charged, the kind of intensity that does not require nakedness to devastate, that lives in the almosts, in gestures interrupted by unsteady breaths, in the pressure of fingers that ask for more without uttering a word. When the world sharpened again, I was leaning my forehead against his chest, listening to Ruggiero's heartbeat at a rhythm that still hadn't steadied. He held me with both arms, pressed tight against him as though I were the only solid thing in a world he had just dismantled with his own hands. The sea breeze washed over us carrying salt and silence, and the lights of Catania went on glowing in the distance, indifferent to the fact that two people on the terrace of a Sicilian mansion had just rewritten their own story. "Don't ignore me again," I said, the words muffled against the fabric of his shirt, feeling the vibration of his voice in his chest before I heard it. "Never again," he answered. And this time the promise was not only words, it was the tightening of his arms around me, his mouth pressed to the top of my head, the way he inhaled deeply and drew me closer still, as though closer were a distance that could yet be reduced. We stayed until the wind cooled and the moon shifted overhead. He held me as if I were the only real thing in a world built of alliances, betrayals, and rules designed to ensure that men like him never obtained what they truly wanted. And I let myself be held, for the first time without resistance, without armor, without the fierce compulsion to prove I needed no one. Because needing him did not make me less. It completed me in a way I had spent my entire life pretending did not exist. Chapter 8. The Shadow in the Morning. I woke the next morning in Ruggiero's room. The bed beside me was empty. I crossed to the window and looked out over the gardens soaked in early light. Everything appeared settled, the debt laid bare, the choice made, the silence traded for something that resembled truth. But when my gaze drifted to the far corner of the garden, near the stone wall, I noticed something that did not belong. Tassilo stood there, speaking with a man I recognized from the ball, one of the figures who had orbited Ennio's circle. The exchange looked casual, even amicable, and that was precisely what unsettled me. Tassilo had no reason to be talking to one of Ennio's people. Not like that. Not with that kind of familiarity. I stayed frozen at the window, watching. Then Tassilo glanced up and found me, and looked away, too quickly. The kind of averted gaze that is never accidental. It is guilt, or dread, or something that occupies the narrow space between the two. Ennio's man disappeared through the side gate. Tassilo walked back toward the mansion without turning around. I said nothing. I didn't call for Ruggiero, didn't go downstairs to confront anyone. I remained where I was, fingers pressed white against the windowsill, my heart beating at a frequency that no longer belonged to the love of the night before. It was something older, more instinctive, the reflex of someone raised in the shadow of a world where nothing is ever quite what it appears. The peace was real. The love was real. What I had felt on the terrace, wrapped in Ruggiero's arms, his voice vibrating against my skin like a confession. Every part of it was real. I believed that with the same conviction I believed my own name. But I was also the daughter of a man who died in debt. I had grown up learning that trust is the first thing they strip from you when the world comes to collect, and that peace, in that universe, is never a condition. It is an interval. A pause between two strikes where people fill their lungs and pretend the next one isn't already on its way. I stared at the empty garden, at the stone bench where Tassilo had been standing moments before, and thought that perhaps this was the true price of loving a man like Ruggiero Cavouri. Not the danger, not the debts, not the enemies, but the impossibility of looking at a beautiful morning without searching, by instinct, for the shadow it conceals. Lena here, that wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. The peace lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks sleeping beside the most dangerous man in Sicily, until he started locking doors again, speaking in hushed tones, and looking at me with that look. the one that says he's about to put me in the dark again. In the 4th week, I woke up to a cold bed and an armed man at the bedroom door. Ruggiero had left in the middle of the night to do something I wasn't allowed to see. Then a photo appeared on my phone. Old, faded, my father's face smiling beside someone who shouldn't have been there. And below it, a single line. Ask your husband what happened that night. The war hadn't ended. It had switched sides, and the secret was his. Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.